Rhett Holloway stood by the window of his ranch house, his gaze drifting over the snow-covered plains that stretched for miles. The morning was cold, the Wyoming wind biting through the cracks in the old wooden walls. It had been 7 years since he buried his wife, Catherine. He could still remember the raw pain of that day, the way the earth had swallowed her and their unborn children. The burial was a cold affair, and the silence that followed had haunted him ever since. He hadn't known it then, but losing her was only the beginning. He had spent the last 7 years drowning in grief, trying to rebuild a life without her, but it was never the same. He never expected that one quiet morning everything would change. It started with a knock, soft, hesitant at first. Red had been sitting by the fire, his boots on the hearth, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling beside him. He didn't expect anyone, but the knock persisted, growing louder. He rose from his chair, his heart thumping in his chest. As he crossed the room, his boots echoing on the floor, he wondered who it could be. It was far too early for neighbors, and the winter was harsh. As he reached the door, he opened it to find two little girls standing on the threshold. They were identical, two tiny figures wrapped in threadbare coats, their faces pale from the cold. They looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes, green like his own, and Rhett's heart skipped a beat. His first thought was that they looked familiar, but he couldn't place why. Their faces seemed to pull at something deep inside him, something that had been buried for years. "Are you Rhett Holloway?" one of the girls asked in a small, timid voice. Rhett nodded, unsure what to say. The other girl stepped forward, her words coming out in unison with her twins. "Daddy, Mama said to come home." The words hit Rhett like a physical blow. His knees nearly buckled beneath him, and he grasped the doorframe to steady himself. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. His wife, his dead wife, had been gone for 7 years. He had watched her coffin lowered into the frozen ground with his own hands. His grief had been suffocating, consuming him. And yet, here were two young girls standing on his doorstep, calling him daddy. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. His throat felt dry, and for a moment he could hardly breathe. The girls stepped inside when he didn't stop them, and Rhett couldn't stop them. They walked into his home with an eerie familiarity, their eyes never leaving his. They were the same height, the same face, the same green eyes. They looked like they could be 6 years old, maybe younger. They looked like her. The first girl, the one who had spoken, handed him something. Rhett took the object in his trembling hands. It was a silver locket. He turned it over and gasped. It was the same locket he had given Catherine on their wedding night. The same one he had bought for her when he had hoped they would have twins. The second girl pulled out a matching locket from under her coat, and the sight of it made Rhett's blood run cold. "Where did you get this?" Rhett asked, his voice shaking now. The second girl, Grace, took a deep breath and spoke in her soft, quiet voice. "Mama said you'd know what to do." She looked up at him with those familiar green eyes, the same eyes as Catherine's. "She's waiting for you, Daddy. Mama's in the mountains." The world seemed to stop. Rhett stared at the girls, his mind struggling to process what they were saying. Catherine had died. He had buried her with his own hands, along with their unborn children. But these girls, these twins, were wearing lockets he had given to Catherine. They had her eyes, her face, her birthmark, the crescent moon-shaped mark that had been behind her left ear, the same mark he had. And now they were telling him that she was alive, hiding in the mountains. His breath caught in his chest. "Your mother is alive?" he whispered, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. Emma nodded solemnly, her tiny hand gripping Grace's. "Mama said she's hiding because bad men are looking for her." The coldness of their words sent a shiver down Rhett's spine. He wanted to believe them, but his heart wasn't ready for the possibility. He had mourned for 7 long years. How could this be real? Before he could speak, the door opened and in walked Mrs. Hartley, his neighbor. She carried a basket of supplies, but her gaze stopped when she saw the girls standing in the doorway. She froze, her eyes widening with shock. Lord have mercy, Mrs. Hartley muttered. They're the spitting image of Catherine, and twins, no less. Rhett stood motionless, his thoughts racing. His mind could barely keep up with the whirlwind of emotions crashing into him. He had buried Catherine. He had mourned for 7 years, not knowing that the woman he loved was alive, somewhere, watching him from afar. Who are they? Mrs. Hartley asked, looking from Rhett to the girls. They're mine, Rhett replied, his voice trembling. They say their mother's alive, and that she's waiting for me in the mountains. Mrs. Hartley's jaw dropped. But that's impossible. You saw her body, Rhett. We all did. You buried her. Rhett's hands clenched into fists. His mind was a blur. He needed to know the truth. He had to find out who these girls were, and if Catherine was truly alive. Why would she fake her death? And why had she stayed away for so long? As Mrs. Hartley spoke in stunned disbelief, Rhett turned toward the window, looking out at the graveyard where Catherine was buried. The wind whistled outside, carrying the cold of the mountains into the room. The girls' voices broke through the silence again. Mama said you'd know what to do, Daddy. Rhett's gaze turned to the grave of Catherine and their unborn twins. His heart tightened in his chest. If Catherine was alive, if this was real, why had she let him suffer for 7 years? Why had she let him grieve for her, for the children they had lost, if they had truly survived? The question burned through him, unanswered and unspoken, but it was the only thing that mattered now. Rhett made up his mind. He would find her. He would find Catherine, and he would finally get the answers he needed, no matter what it took. I'm riding to Shadow Ridge at first light, he said quietly, a determined fire igniting in his chest. Rhett, it could be a con, the sheriff warned him, his voice cautious. Twins showing up like this, it's mighty convenient. Rhett didn't listen. He didn't care. The hope that had been buried for so long was starting to rise again. He had to know the truth, no matter how impossible it seemed. As the night fell, Rhett loaded his rifle with grim determination. He looked at the girls one last time, their innocent eyes full of trust, and whispered under his breath, if she's alive, if she's really out there, I will find her, and I'll make things right. But as the fire crackled behind him, one question echoed in his mind like a thunderclap. Why did she let me grieve for all 3 of them for 7 years? Rhett awoke early, the first light of dawn barely touching the snow-covered plains as he saddled his horse. The twins had fallen asleep in the warmth of the hearth, their tiny bodies curled together, their hands still holding tightly as if afraid to let go. His heart ached as he thought of Catherine, how she had once held him, how they had dreamt of their future. But now, 7 years after her supposed death, he was faced with the impossible. 2 little girls, identical and strange, telling him that their mother was alive, hiding somewhere in the mountains. He couldn't deny it any longer. He had to go. The air was bitterly cold as he rode past Catherine's grave, stopping for a moment to stare at the headstone. It was a cruel reminder of everything he had lost, but it also fueled his determination. If there was even the slightest chance she was out there, if these girls, his daughters, were telling the truth, he had to know. He urged his horse forward, the long journey through the mountainous terrain stretching out before him. The trails were treacherous, winding and narrow, with cliffs on either side. His mind raced with questions. How could Catherine have survived? Why hadn't she come home? Could it really be her? The mountain air grew thicker with each passing mile, and the tension in his chest grew heavier. As he crested a ridge, he saw the faint outline of a cabin in the distance. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and for a fleeting moment, hope surged through him. He approached slowly, rifle at the ready, unsure of what he would find. The cabin appeared to be abandoned, weathered by years of isolation, but it felt like his entire world was about to change. He called out, his voice carrying through the silence. "Show yourself." The door creaked open, and standing there, framed by the doorway, was Catherine. She looked different, thin, older, and her once vibrant face was now drawn with fear. But there was no mistaking her. The sight of her almost brought Rhett to his knees. He stumbled forward, his breath catching in his throat. "You're alive?" he whispered, disbelief clouding his thoughts. Catherine's eyes welled with tears. "Rhett, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to think I was dead. But I had to do it. I had to fake my death to keep you and the twins safe." She stepped forward, her voice trembling as she explained the horrors she had endured. Her father's debt to a dangerous crime boss, Donovan Pike, had forced her to make an impossible choice. With her pregnancy nearing full term, and her sister Sarah also pregnant, Sarah had made a heartbreaking sacrifice. She had dressed as Catherine and gone to the ravine, where Pike's men had found her, thinking it was Catherine. The body had been thrown into the ravine, destroyed beyond recognition, but the doctor had only confirmed it was a pregnant woman. Catherine had fled, hiding in the mountains, giving birth alone to the twins, Emma and Grace. She had raised them in isolation for the past 6 years, terrified of what Pike's men would do if they found her. She explained that Pike was out of prison now and had started searching for her again, his men already spotted near town. "I kept running, Rhett," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "But now I can't keep hiding. The twins deserve to know their father. If Pike finds out, he'll use them against me." Rhett felt his heart twist in his chest. His emotions warred within him. Rage, relief, betrayal, and confusion all tangled together. "You let me grieve for 7 years, Catherine," he said, his voice thick with pain. "I mourn for you, for our children." Catherine's face crumpled with regret. "Every day was agony, Rhett, but I thought it was the only way to protect you, to protect our girls." Just then, the sound of horses approaching broke through their conversation, and Catherine's face went pale. She grabbed Rhett's hand. "They found us," she whispered, fear flooding her eyes. Rhett's heart raced as he reached for his rifle. "We have to go," he said, determination setting in. But as he prepared to face the men who were after his family, he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal and the question that still burned in his mind. Why did she let me suffer all these years? Catherine's voice trembled as she grabbed Rhett's hand, pulling him into the mountain path. The sound of the approaching horses, the clinking of metal against leather, was too close for comfort. Rhett could hear the crunch of hooves on the snow-covered ground, the growl of a man's voice in the distance. Pike's men were getting closer, and Catherine's fear deepened. She had hidden herself in these mountains for years, but now, after all this time, it seemed like her past was catching up with her. Rhett's grip tightened on her hand as they navigated the narrow path that led down toward the forest. His mind was a whirlwind. How could this be happening? How could Catherine, the woman he had loved and lost, be standing here in front of him, alive? His heart ached with the weight of everything he had suffered over the years. He had mourned for her, buried her, built a life without her. And yet, here she was, her presence bringing back every painful memory and every unspoken question. His body moved on instinct as they pushed forward, stepping over rocks, climbing through thick underbrush. The cold wind bit his face, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were too consumed by Catherine and the twins, Emma and Grace, the girls who had appeared at his doorstep, who claimed he was their father. His mind swirled with doubt, confusion, and longing. How had they survived? If Catherine had been hiding all these years, how could he not have known? The answer lay ahead in the mountains, with Catherine, the woman who had faked her death to protect him. They reached the edge of the forest, and Rhett's breath caught in his throat as he caught sight of the cabin in the distance. It was isolated, just as Catherine had described it, nestled between towering pines and surrounded by snow. The smoke rising from the chimney was the only sign of life. Rhett paused for a moment, his heart thundering in his chest. This was the place where Catherine had lived all these years, alone and in hiding, raising their daughters in secret. He wanted to believe her, to trust that everything she had told him was the truth, but the wounds of his past were too fresh. He had buried his wife. He had mourned for her. He had thought he would never see her again. And now, here she was standing beside him, leading him to a cabin where their children had grown up, their identities hidden for years. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. As they approached the cabin, Rhett noticed the door was slightly ajar. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his back, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. He could feel the tension building inside him, and his instincts were telling him to be cautious. "Stay close," he whispered to Catherine, who nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The wind howled through the trees, and the world around them felt frozen, both in time and in reality. As they approached the door, Rhett's hand brushed against Catherine's, his mind still racing with questions. She had sacrificed so much, but what was the real cost? Why had she stayed away for so long? What had she been hiding from? And now, why did it feel like they were walking into a trap? He reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by the flickering light of a small fire. The smell of pine and burning wood filled the air. It was rustic and bare, with only the necessities scattered about. Rhett's gaze swept over the room, taking in the faint outline of a bed in the corner, a small table where a few items were carelessly piled together. But there, sitting by the fire, was a figure, slender, worn, but unmistakably Catherine. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She turned to him, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes, those same green eyes, were still familiar. Her gaze softened as she looked at him, and for a moment, everything else faded away. "Rhett," she said, her voice trembling. She stood, her body frail and thin, as if the years of hiding and running had taken their toll. She stepped toward him, but there was hesitation in her movements, as if she wasn't sure how to approach him after everything that had happened. Rhett's heart twisted with a mixture of relief and anger. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it was finally here, it felt like everything was different. He reached for her, his arms aching to pull her close, to feel her warmth, to remind himself that she was real. But something held him back. He wanted to scream at her, demand answers, but all he could do was stand there, lost in her eyes. Catherine stepped forward, her voice soft as she spoke. "I never want to hurt you, Rhett. I never wanted to make you believe I was dead. But I had no choice. Pike was after us. I had to protect you, protect our girls." The words hit Rhett like a hammer. "Pike?" he repeated, the name bitter on his tongue. His mind went back to the nights when he had feared for Catherine's life, the days when he had searched for her in vain. And now, she was telling him that a crime boss had forced her into hiding. She had sacrificed so much to keep them safe. But at what cost? "I didn't want to leave you," Catherine continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I couldn't risk losing you, Rhett. I couldn't risk losing our girls. If Pike knew I had children, he would have used them against me. He would have hurt them, and I couldn't let that happen." Rhett's fists clenched at his sides as the weight of her words sank in. He had lost 7 years of their lives, of their family, because Catherine had chosen to keep them hidden. He had buried her. He had mourned for her. And now, she was telling him that it had all been for nothing. He wanted to be angry, but the truth was too overwhelming. His mind kept flashing back to the twins, the girls who had knocked on his door just days ago, claiming to be his daughters. He had to know the truth. "If you were alive, Catherine," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "why didn't you come back? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me know that our children were alive?" Catherine's face crumpled in sorrow. "I never wanted to hurt you, Rhett. I never wanted you to mourn. I thought it would be safer this way. For you. For us." Her voice broke, and she took a step back, as if the weight of everything she had done was finally too much to bear. Rhett's heart ached for her, for the woman who had been forced to make impossible choices. But as the reality of the situation settled in, another thought crept into his mind. Pike was still out there, and he wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted. Catherine's eyes grew wide with fear. Pike got out of prison 3 months ago, she said urgently. His men are hunting for us. They're near town, Rhett. They're coming for us. Rhett's heart skipped a beat, and the reality of the situation hit him with full force. They were running out of time. Pike was coming, and this time, Rhett wasn't going to let him take his family without a fight. But as he looked at Catherine, her tear-filled eyes pleading for forgiveness, one question remained unanswered. Why had she let him suffer for all those years? The days that followed were a blur of preparation, tension thickening the air around Holloway Ranch like the winter fog that rolled in off the plains. Rhett's mind raced, each thought more urgent than the last. Pike was out there, somewhere, with his men, and every passing hour felt like a countdown to the inevitable. But Rhett wasn't about to run. He wasn't about to let Pike take Catherine and their daughters without a fight. Catherine had made her sacrifice, hidden for years, and now Rhett would do whatever it took to protect his family, even if it meant facing the very man who had forced her into hiding in the first place. The plan was simple: lure Pike into a trap, and when he came, they would be ready. At Miller's Crossing, a spot that had once been a busy crossroads but had now fallen into disuse, they would wait for him. The old mill at the heart of the crossing would be their battleground, a place where Pike's men would be caught unaware. With the sheriff and 6 of the toughest ranchers in the area, Rhett was confident they could take Pike down. It wasn't the kind of fight he wanted, but it was the only choice left. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Rhett gathered the men at the ranch, giving them their orders in hushed voices. Each man had a rifle, and they would take up their positions at the mill, hidden in the surrounding trees and tall grass. Catherine, despite her fear, insisted on being part of the plan. If he wants me, use that, she had said. But Rhett resisted, wanting nothing more than to protect her and keep her safe. The thought of her in danger again made his stomach twist, but Catherine had been clear. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about their family. It was about their girls. The tension in the air was palpable as the night drew near. Catherine stood by the fire in the kitchen, her face drawn with worry, as Emma and Grace slept in the next room, unaware of the storm that was about to break. She glanced over at Rhett, his face set in stone as he prepared himself for what lay ahead. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark with the weight of responsibility. She could see the man he had become, the one who had lost so much and was now determined to protect what was left. But she also saw the man who had once loved her with everything he had, the man who had mourned her for years, and she could still feel the ache in her own heart. This wasn't the way she had wanted it to be. She had always dreamed of a life where they could be together, raising their children in peace. But that dream had been shattered the moment Pike came into their lives. And now, she would have to watch Rhett face danger once more, knowing that the man who had stolen everything from them was still out there, waiting. "Stay safe," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. Rhett looked up at her, his gaze softening for a moment. He stepped toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder, a silent promise passing between them. "I'll be back," he said, his voice steady, but there was a heaviness to it, a finality that hung in the air. Catherine nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him again. She had already lost him once. She couldn't survive it a second time. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and Rhett mounted his horse, motioning for the others to follow. They rode out together, their horses' hooves crunching in the snow as they made their way toward Miller's Crossing. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the landscape. There was no turning back now. When they reached the mill, Rhett dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he gave his final orders. "Stay quiet, stay hidden. We wait for Pike." The men spread out, taking up their positions behind the trees, along the broken stone wall of the mill, and in the long grasses that grew wild near the water's edge. Rhett glanced over his shoulder at the dark outline of the mill, his pulse quickening. Every instinct in him told him that Pike was coming, and with him, a fight that could change everything. Minutes passed like hours, and the cold seeped into Rhett's bones. But he forced himself to stay alert. His thoughts flickered to Catherine and the twins. He had to keep them safe. He had to make sure Pike never got his hands on them. Then, just as the last bit of daylight slipped away, the sound of hooves reached Rhett's ears. His breath caught in his throat. The time had come. "Get ready," he murmured to the men, his voice barely above a whisper. He took his rifle in hand, his grip steady as he scanned the horizon. The sound of the horses grew louder, and soon, 4 riders appeared on the trail. Pike was among them, dressed in black, his cold eyes scanning the area as he rode ahead. Rhett's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He could feel the tension building, the air thick with the promise of violence. The riders slowed as they approached the mill, their horses' hooves crunching in the snow, and the sound of their voices carried on the wind. Pike's men had no idea what was waiting for them. As soon as Pike dismounted, Rhett and the others sprang into action. "You're surrounded, Pike." Rhett's voice rang out across the clearing, his rifle raised. Pike's eyes flashed with surprise, but his expression quickly turned to one of cold calculation. "You think I came unprepared?" he sneered. And in that instant, more men emerged from the shadows, surrounding the group in a ring of guns and violence. A gunfight erupted in the blink of an eye. Bullets flew, men dove for cover, and the air was filled with the deafening sounds of battle. Rhett fired, his shots precise as he made his way toward Catherine, who had stepped forward, trying to help but now caught in the chaos. Pike was fast, too fast. In a heartbeat, he had Catherine by the throat, holding a knife to her skin. "Drop the guns, or she dies," he snarled. Rhett's blood boiled as he raised his rifle, but Pike's grip on Catherine only tightened. "Don't do it, Rhett," Catherine pleaded, her voice hoarse. "If you shoot, they'll take the girls. Please." Rhett froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The twins, Emma and Grace, were still in danger. But Pike wasn't going to stop. He would take them, and he would keep coming back until he got what he wanted. With a roar, Rhett fired, the bullet grazing Pike's shoulder. Pike howled in pain, releasing his grip on Catherine. But before Rhett could react, Pike fired back. The bullet struck Rhett's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. He gritted his teeth, fighting through the pain, but Pike's men were retreating. The fight was over for now. Pike disappeared into the night, swearing that it wasn't over, that he would come back. But for a moment, as the sound of horses faded into the distance, Rhett couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. They had survived, but as Catherine cradled his wounded body, tears in her eyes, he knew that the battle was far from over. Pike would return, and when he did, Rhett wasn't sure they would be ready. 3 weeks had passed since the gunfight at Miller's Crossing, and Rhett still lay in bed, his shoulder wound healing slowly under the careful ministrations of Catherine. The pain was still there, a constant reminder of the battle they had fought, but it was the emotional weight that was the hardest to bear. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and quiet moments, the world outside moving at a pace far too fast for Rhett to keep up with. His body had started to mend, but his heart, though still cracked, was slowly beginning to heal as well. Catherine never left his side, tending to his needs with a tenderness he hadn't known in years. She would sit beside him in the evenings, reading aloud from the books they had once enjoyed together, her voice a soothing balm to the wounds that ran deeper than just the physical. The twins, Emma and Grace, had been a constant presence as well, their bright eyes and innocent laughter filling the space of a ranch that had once been so silent. They had helped him with little chores, always together, always in sync, as if they couldn't be separated even for a moment. Emma had taken it upon herself to help Rhett with his books, her young mind eager to learn. while Grace had found comfort in the animals, spending hours with the goats and chickens, her soft hands brushing over their fur and feathers with a care that belied her age. It was as if they were the thread that had been missing in Rhett's life, weaving him back into the fabric of the world he had once known, and yet everything felt so fragile. As much as he had longed for their return, Rhett couldn't shake the weight of the decisions that had led them here. Catherine's absence had torn him apart, and now, having her back in his life again felt like a puzzle piece finally falling into place. But there was still a lingering unease. They were not safe. Not yet. Pike was still out there, and the threat he posed hadn't gone away. He would come again, and when he did, Rhett wasn't sure they would be ready. But for now, the only thing Rhett could focus on was the slow process of rebuilding. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight hit the land, he would force himself to get up, to push through the pain, and to be there for his family. He owed them that. He owed Catherine that. She had given up so much for him, for their family, and now it was his turn to do the same. He could see how much she had suffered, the guilt that weighed on her every time she looked at him, the way her eyes would cloud with grief when she thought he wasn't looking. She had spent 7 years in hiding, living in fear, always afraid that someone like Pike, would come for her for the girls. Rhett knew that her sacrifice hadn't been an easy one. It had torn her apart as much as it had torn him, but the love between them had never died, no matter how much time had passed. And now, they had a chance to rebuild, to find each other again. But Pike wouldn't make it easy. He couldn't. He wouldn't just let them go. The news came one evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The sheriff had sent word that Pike had been spotted just a few towns over, gathering men for another attack. He was close, closer than they had thought. The small sense of peace they had been holding on is shattered. Rhett's heart tightened in his chest as the weight of the truth pressed down on him. Pike was coming, and this time, he wasn't going to back down. He had promised that he would return, and now, it seemed like that promise was about to be fulfilled. The days that followed were filled with frantic preparations. Rhett and Catherine spoke in hushed tones, planning their next move, strategizing how to protect the girls. There was no way to be sure that they would make it through this time, but they couldn't run. Not again. Rhett would fight until his last breath to keep his family safe. As the days passed, the tension built. Rhett's wound had begun to heal, but his mind was far from calm. He couldn't stop thinking about the girls, Emma and Grace, who were still so young, so innocent. They had already been through so much, and now they were about to face even more danger. He couldn't bear the thought of losing them, of losing Catherine again. And yet, he knew they had to be prepared. Pike would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He had already taken too much from them, and Rhett couldn't let that happen again. On the night before Pike was expected to arrive, Rhett stood by the window, staring out at the quiet ranch, the stillness of the night wrapping around him like a blanket. Catherine stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her presence a silent comfort. "We'll get through this," she said softly, her voice full of conviction. "We've made it this far. We can't let him take everything again." Rhett nodded, though his heart was heavy. He wanted to believe her, but he knew that tomorrow would be the true test. Tomorrow, they would face Pike once again. And this time, there would be no running, no hiding. They would stand together, but they would fall together. The morning came too quickly. The air was cold, and the ground was covered in a thin layer of frost. But the ranch was alive with activity. The men had gathered, the sheriff had brought in reinforcements, and everyone was prepared to do whatever it took to stop Pike. Rhett gave the final orders, making sure that everyone knew their positions, that they were ready for the worst. Catherine and the twins would stay inside, hidden in the barn with Mrs. Hartley and a few of the other women in town. It was the safest place, and Rhett knew it was the only way to keep them out of harm's way. As he walked toward the front of the ranch, his heart pounded in his chest. He had made peace with the fact that he might not survive this. He had already lost so much that he couldn't even begin to understand. And now, There was a chance that he might lose everything again. But he couldn't think about that. He had to focus. He had to protect his family. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the sound of hooves reached Rhett's ears. Pike was coming. He was getting closer. The moment of truth had arrived. The ranch was quiet now, save for the sounds of the horses in the distance. Rhett took a deep breath, the weight of what was to come pressing down on him. The world felt as though it had stopped moving, and for a moment, he thought about everything he had lost, everything he had fought for. Catherine, the girls, his home. He would protect them all, no matter what it took. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and gunpowder, and the sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Rhett turned toward the barn, where Catherine and the girls were hidden, and gave them one last look. It was time. Pike had arrived, and this time, Rhett was ready. He would do whatever it took to make sure that his family stayed safe, even if it meant facing death itself. The day had come. Rhett stood in the dim light of the barn, his rifle held tightly in his hands. Every muscle in his body tensed as the distant sound of hooves drew closer. Pike and his men were here, right on time, and there would be no turning back. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the ranch as the wind howled through the barren trees. The final standoff was upon them. Rhett's heart pounded, not just from the adrenaline, but from the sheer weight of everything that was at stake. His family, his wife, his twin daughters, the life he had fought so hard to rebuild. It all rested on this moment. Catherine stood beside him, her face pale but determined. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, everything else seemed to fade. He saw the woman he had once loved, the woman he thought he had lost forever, and the mother of their children. She had been through so much, and now they were going to fight to protect everything they had left. He glanced over his shoulder at the barn where Emma and Grace were hiding, their faces pressed against the small cracks in the wood, their tiny bodies trembling with fear. He couldn't help but feel the weight of their innocence. These girls, his daughters, had been through so much already, and now they were about to face even more danger. He had promised them that they would be safe, that he would protect them. He couldn't afford to fail now. "We have to hold them off," Rhett said quietly, his voice hoarse. Catherine nodded, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She had made it clear that she wouldn't stand by and watch while her family fought. She had already sacrificed enough. This time, she would stand beside him. "We will," she replied, her voice steady. "We're ready." They had prepared for this. Every inch of the ranch had been scouted. Every route to the barn had been covered, and each of the ranchers was positioned in the trees, hidden and waiting. They had the element of surprise on their side, and they were going to use it. But Rhett knew that it wasn't going to be easy. Pike had already shown how ruthless he could be, and the men he had with him were just as dangerous. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about taking back everything that had been stolen from them. The sound of horses grew louder, and Rhett could feel the tension in his body. He checked his rifle one more time, making sure it was loaded, and glanced back at Catherine. Her hand was resting on the revolver at her hip, her face set with determination. She had spent 7 years hiding from Pike, living in fear. Now, she was ready to fight, to make sure that he never got his hands on them again. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the barn, and Rhett's eyes narrowed as he heard the unmistakable sound of horses coming down the trail. He could see them now, 4 riders with Pike at the lead. They moved slowly, cautiously, as though they knew something was wrong, but they didn't know where the danger would come from. Rhett raised his hand, signaling to the other men in the trees. It was time. The ranchers moved into position, taking their rifles and aiming at Pike and his men. "On my mark," Rhett whispered, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. He took a deep breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Now," he called, and in an instant, shots rang out, echoing across the ranch. The first shot struck one of Pike's men in the shoulder, sending him tumbling off his horse. The others reacted instantly, pulling out their guns and returning fire. The air was filled with the sharp crack of gunfire, the sound of men shouting, and the screams of horses as they bolted in fear. Catherine and Rhett crouched low, their eyes scanning the chaos unfolding in front of them. The ranchers were holding their ground, but the fight wasn't over yet. Pike's men were ruthless, their gunfire relentless. But they were outnumbered. Slowly, the ranchers started to gain the upper hand, picking off Pike's men one by one. It was then that Rhett saw Pike, cold and calculating, darting from cover to cover, his face twisted in rage. Rhett's heart raced as he aimed his rifle at Pike, his finger pressing lightly on the trigger. But before he could pull it, a shout echoed across the clearing. "Catherine!" Rhett spun around to see one of Pike's men aiming a gun at her, his finger twitching on the trigger. His heart stopped. Without thinking, Rhett fired, the bullet striking the man in the chest and sending him falling to the ground. Catherine ducked behind a pile of crates, her breath coming in short gasps. "Are you all right?" Rhett called, his voice filled with panic. Catherine nodded, her eyes wide but determined. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely audible over the gunfire. "Stay focused, Rhett. We can do this." Rhett didn't have time to respond. Pike was on the move again, ducking behind a tree for cover. He was trying to flank them, to get around to the back of the barn. Rhett's instincts kicked in, and he motioned to one of the ranchers to cut off Pike's escape. As the rancher moved into position, Rhett took a deep breath and prepared himself for what was coming. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight to take back everything they had lost, to make sure Pike would never threaten their family again. Pike peered from behind his cover, his eyes locked on Rhett's. For a moment, everything went still. It was as if time itself had frozen. Pike's cold smile stretched across his face. "You think you've won, Holloway?" he sneered. "You think you can protect them? You're nothing. You'll always be nothing." Rhett's heart burned with fury, but he kept his focus, his rifle steady in his hands. He wasn't going to let Pike win. "Not this time. I've already won, Pike," Rhett called back, his voice steady, unwavering. "This ends now." The next few seconds felt like an eternity as the two men locked eyes, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. Then, without warning, the gunfire resumed, the ranchers pressing the attack from all sides. Pike's men were falling, one by one, their numbers dwindling with each passing second. Pike, realizing he was losing, turned to flee, his horse galloping away as he disappeared into the trees. But Rhett wasn't about to let him get away. He sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, his rifle aimed at Pike's retreating figure. He fired but missed. Pike was fast, too fast. But just as he reached the tree line, a shot rang out from the shadows. One of the ranchers, hidden in the trees, had taken the shot. Pike collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground as his horse continued to gallop into the night. The fight was over. Rhett stood there for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the smoke from the gunfire slowly cleared. The adrenaline slowly began to fade, and in its place, a deep sense of exhaustion washed over him. He had done it. He had protected his family. They had won. But as he turned back toward the barn, he saw Catherine standing in the doorway, her face pale and tear-streaked but relieved. Emma and Grace stood beside her, their little hands clasped together, their eyes wide with fear but safe. Rhett walked toward them, his heart swelling with pride and love for the family he had fought for. As he reached them, the girls ran into his arms, their tiny bodies clinging to him. "We're safe, Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "You saved us." Rhett smiled, his heart full as he held them close. "We're safe, sweetheart, and we always will be." Catherine stepped forward, her hand resting on his shoulder as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. "You did it," she said softly, her voice trembling. Rhett nodded, his eyes soft as he looked at her. "We did it, Catherine. Together." The sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the ranch as the battle finally came to an end. The Holloway family, once shattered and broken, was whole again, and this time they were stronger than ever. As they stood together, the wind carrying the sound of distant birds and the promise of a new day, Rhett knew that they had overcome the darkness. They had survived, and no matter what came next, they would face it together.